Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another edition of our essay discussions, this one with a slight twist. We are discussing Peter Hitchens' Q A on the death penalty, but alongside that, we are taking a look at some slides put together by Mr. iTunes Eye, a topic of particular interest to him. So I'll go through the rest of the panel, and I think he can take us through quite a lot of this as opposed to me. So with me, I have got Rupert, as always.
Hello.
And Freelance.
Hello.
And as I said, we have iTunes. So do you want to discuss why we've chosen to do the death penalty this week, iTunes?
Yeah, it's sort of fitting because today is, as I said, Easter Monday is today, and Jesus got crucified. It wasn't the intent, first of all, but it worked out. But for a paper I had to do for school, I read the Q&A on the death penalty by Peter Hitchens. It's really, really nicely and really tight written, and so I recommended it, and it got and now we're doing it, I guess. So yeah, and the death penalty is to interest to me because it's you have to be really convicted about it, because you have to be ready to send somebody into death. So that's this will come to some really interesting legal and moral convictions or beliefs as well. So yeah, here we go.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting topic because two big things come to mind. I think that, as you say, if you are a supporter of the death penalty, you have to be quite you really have to be thorough in your belief, whereas you can be quite flippant with it if you're on the opposing side. If you're someone that's against it, you're not really expected to put up much of an argument. But if you're trying to put an argument in favor of it, people will really scrutinize it. As you say, with good reason, as it is, the taking of a life. But it's also a topic that seems to fall into the bracket of, I know when I was in school, it's something that's generally accepted as a discussable topic. So it's ones that, although it's quite often taught, the death penalty and the pros and cons of it, it's never actually discussed it's always viewed with this historical context. These are the arguments that were for it, and these are the arguments that have won out against it. It's never an actual living topic. It's always, this is why this argument is now concluded, because the right side has won.
Well, I was just going to say that would also be potentially an interesting, or one caveat to lay out before we actually get into the meat of the arguments, is that in some sense, this is probably something that comes partially down to a certain amount of personality disposition. So call me a little bit cynical, but I doubt we'll be persuading anybody with this. But an exploration of the arguments is going to be interesting nonetheless to examine their veracity. But it does seem like something that that people are either sort of emotionally okay with or emotionally not okay with, and I see very rarely people sort of switching unless it's towards towards being against the death penalty.
Yeah, maybe Freelance could speak on this, because I agree. I think this is a topic that a lot of it is emotionally driven, and people will come to their conclusion and then rationalize this afterwards. And I think, Freelance, you've recently read Righteous Mind and such. So would you agree with me on that?
I think that it's a very emotionally driven topic, because if you would actively say that you're for the death penalty, then you would actually say that you're willing to murder somebody, which is never a good story to tell to somebody else, unless you are living in a society which would mind. But the current day society, it would be seen as something very bad.
Well, I have to interject here because of the rhetorical grounds. It's this is no point to you, but the wording is very important, and me being a non-English speaker might be in a disadvantage here because the rhetorical game is really strong of this. For example, one of the first points is that murder and killing is for most people the same or intertwined, while it's not the same. But I think we can go to this in a later bit.
Yeah, I thought you were going to to pick up on that. Right, let's go through the slides. Should we actually just talk about the essay itself first? So it's put out as it states, it's a Q&A on the death penalty. It's kind of a question and answer through some of the most common refutations that people have against the death penalty, with Peter Hitchens putting up his arguments against it. Whilst going through the slides that you prepared, we touch on most of the questions that he asked, but I think at the end, if we don't cover any of them, then we can just bring up the actual essay and take a look at them directly.
All right, for me. Okay, so one of the maybe something that you should read if you're talking about the punishment or the capital punishment in the Commonwealth is if you read this report on the Royal Commission on the capital punishment. It's linked here. Yeah, it's quite a good read. So yeah.
Could you summarize it?
I actually have just skimmed it, so I did not focus completely on it because I had to do a lot of reading and I had to skip on some parts. This year I only skimmed it. In skimming it, I picked up it's going on the deterrence. If it deters if capital punishment deters the death penalty, and the conclusion it's somewhat hard to conclude because when the death penalty is abolished and when it was last used for punishment and going up to the death penalty is how much it used before it was abolished. Does this make somewhat sense?
Yeah. Yes. So this is one of the core arguments that that Hitchens was making, was that there's a soft abolishment that takes place before the hard abolishment, as it were, where there is already a movement in the judicial system to move away from the use of the death penalty. Therefore, it ceases to have its deterring effect long before it's formally been abolished. Therefore, comparing between the date just before, let's say a week before it's or a year before it's abolished on the books, and a year after it's abolished on the books, you don't necessarily get a clear picture because it's already faded from general usage. I don't necessarily know how you could turn that into something that is actually properly measurable, though, without catching other factors like cultural change or demographic change or
technology changes.
Technology is another big one as well.
Yeah, you want to expand some further?
Well, so in particular on that point, medical technology. That's another thing. Yes,
exactly.
Another thing that comes into it is that so many more people would die in the past from wounds that have been inflicted, whereas in the present they're only treated so the people don't die, and therefore it's only like an attempted homicide or an assault, perhaps even, or something like that. Yeah, things like that.
Yeah, this is a really big point and a big pet theory of mine, that we actually haven't progressed as society, because all the for example, murder, if you try to stab somebody in the Middle Ages, he's probably going to die on that wounds and you're going to get hanged. But nowadays, if you just stab somebody, the likelihood of him surviving is really, really high. And now you don't, and the increase in stabbings is exponentially almost. So the murders or deaths from inflicted from somebody else got shoved in a low category and aren't punished as hard. So this is a big factor. So you can't really compare 10 years to 10 years before or after, for that way of speaking.
Yeah, and that comes into why, or comes into the soft abolishment, I suppose, because in the process of, you've got simultaneous trends going on. You've got the technological trend, which is reducing the lethality of a lot of these crimes, but then you've also got the trend away from using the death penalty for anything other than the worst crimes. But the worst crimes, let's say it's murder, that is being sort of sidelined as a phenomenon in society anyway. So people are still carrying the same intent into a situation, but they're not being punished as hard for it because other things around that encounter have changed. So that the technology and the willingness to use the death penalty, whereas in the past it would have been used for much more crimes than it is later on.
Yeah, the willingness is an important point. I think nowadays the willingness to kill is much more higher than it was in the past ages. But the point is, if you try to kill somebody, he won't die because of medical innovations. So you got, as I said before, a big shiftment from the categories. It's not longer homicide, it's just stabbing or attempt to wound, something like that. But the willingness to kill is there, and it won't succeed, and it's,
Yeah, exactly the same action is being taken. It's just that our response is now better. So it makes it impossible to actually compare, as you say.
Is it better though?
Well, okay. Let me rephrase that. Our response is more efficient at saving lives. Is what I mean by that. So exactly the same action is being taken by the assailant, but our response, we're now much better at saving the life of the person assaulted. So even though everything that would still be an attempted murder, a lower proportion of those result in an actual murder. So we can't compare the figures.
But in the process, because we are looking at things so much more in so much more of a results-oriented kind of way, we've actually become, in that sense, worse at punishing intent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this is a major aspect of what Hitchens is getting at, which is that figures can be fudged any way that you like, and in this circumstance, a lot of the ways in which you can display them will benefit the side of the anti death penalty side. So he is putting the argument forward as to why none of the statistic orientated arguments are really effective, because none of them give a detailed picture. And so what he puts forward is instead as a counter proposal is a more moral, because he even goes into whether or not the death penalty can be considered a deterrent, and he says there's some instances in which it can be. I think the example that he uses is in situations with robberies, violent robbery.
Yes.
That the incentives have now been changed in such a way that to ensure that the attacker won't get life imprisonment because they think that the person could be a potential witness against them, they're more likely to kill them now. So he's saying the death penalty is a greater deterrent against that, but that some of the arguments that are put forward for the death penalty, in which it's being discussed as a deterrent, are just as unclarified as some of the arguments against it.
Yeah, so I had a conversation about this recently. So the idea of hitting the, I guess, maximum, like the ceiling of punishment much more quickly means that you potentially incentivize somebody to hit that point sooner and then do whatever is necessary to not get caught. So as you say, or as you were alluding to, that example where robbers, so particularly bank robbers, I think was the example that he used, would check each other for weapons to make sure that there's no possibility of someone being murdered, because if someone is murdered in the process of committing the crime, then it adds that extra layer of punishment that they're trying to avoid, because being involved in a robbery only puts you up to the I assume it was imprisonment level of punishment, whereas if murder gets involved, then all of a sudden they're all on the line for that extra next level of punishment, which is the death penalty. Whereas once you take that away, The only consideration is I'm already exposing myself to the risk of being imprisoned, which is the maximum possible level of punishment. Therefore, I'm just going to do whatever is necessary to minimize the risk of me being caught in the first place.
Yes, and it's funny because that exact argument is used by people that don't want the death penalty to be used on people that have committed one murder. I've heard the argument be put forward that if you have the death penalty for a single homicide, then it will incentivize that person to think, well, if I'm going to get killed for one, I will kill another person. So the exact argument is being used on the opposite side. But then if you put forward this idea that they've already hit that, as you might call it, the punishment ceiling, it would get dismissed if you phrase it the other way around.
Yeah, if you want to tactically and strategically win with the argument or make progress, I would always argue from moral standpoints, because I assume they are much more easy to win, because it's proper to execute somebody because he has murdered somebody. It's proper to execute somebody that had committed a terrorist attack. It's proper to execute somebody that has raped somebody. It is a much more responding argument, I would assume.
I would agree. And I think that is likely because it is an emotional first topic that you want a lot of these discussions where we are looking at the statistics. I think I'm with Hitchens on this, where they're ineffective because you can just formulate whatever graph you want and throw it back and forth, and it's a never-ending debate. Whereas at least if you get into the morals of it, then I think a more interesting discussion can be had.
Well, yeah. I would say it has been effective, actually, insofar as it's one of the things that Hitchens points out is the unique level of requirement, I suppose, for satisfactory use of this policy. So we consider it okay or not okay to execute somebody if there is any possibility of them being innocent of the crime, but we're perfectly willing to sacrifice lives for marginal utility gain in other areas. So we're kind of applying the one that he points to is the loss of life associated with the amount of people being on the road that currently are. So if you were that worried about saving every life that's possible, you would vastly reduce the amount of people who are on the road and generally increase the requirements for getting a driving license to try and get the most amount of reckless drivers off the road and thereby prevent deaths by road accidents. But we don't do that because there's utility gain elsewhere in the economy of people being able to move around more easily and such.
Yeah, to that point, I think this drive behind saving every life is permeated everywhere. I mean, just think about the
remember where we are.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I won't say it.
Nothing too difficult.
Yeah, I think you all know in what situation are we because of what is all discussed in the news, and it's that maybe it's an ideology, it's a worldview that if you could just have saved one more life, but it will come for everything. It will come for your cars. It will come from your freedom. It will come for your guns. So you poor UK, you can't own guns, but it will come from them if you own guns somewhere, because if you could save one more.
Net on that.
Yeah, but yeah, I think this. I had this word somewhere. There's actually a specific term for that. Give me a second.
The nanny state or the therapeutic state, or that's the Gottfried term, isn't it? Something like that.
Yeah, go ahead. I will find it and I will say it.
Yeah,
there's actually a technical term for that.
Obviously, there's a lot of comparisons that can be drawn to present-day situations with the arguments of if we can save one life. But what I do want to do is to defend the other side of the aisle. That argument that that he draws a comparison between the deaths on the road to the potential loss of innocent life through executing innocent people.
Yeah.
What I would put forward as a counter is that one of those is a preventative measure. So stopping people driving cars is a preventative measure, whereas if you are putting someone through a trial to potentially execute them, that is slightly different. So I do feel like the argument has some validity, but there are flaws in drawing those direct comparisons between the two actions that you can take.
It has a very different emotional impact, but I think when you lay everything out, especially in light of the extra deterrence side of things, then if we're going to say that maybe 10% of maybe that's too optimistic, like I don't know, even 2% of the murders that take place will be averted because, or intended murders, so you can reduce assaults and things in the process, are going to be prevented by this preventative measure of, or this deterrent measure of having the death penalty on the books and actively used. If how many innocent people would you have to be murdering before you're saving fewer lives by the prevention of that crime than you are ruining with the misapplication of justice? I suspect that you'd have to have a very, very bad track record of hanging the wrong people for it to get to that level. So you're still talking about the same sort of like obfuscated relationship rather than just breaking it down to this one factor of how many lives are we ruining, and is that acceptable?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to put forward arguments that I don't know. We haven't actually gone around the table and seen where people stand on this, but I know that
we're still alive.
I know. I just want to make sure that some arguments are put forward that I think are reasonable, and I want to see how people address them. Because although I am fairly decided on my position, being in support, I think that there's still issues that need to be addressed, and I think it's fair to cover them here. So, sorry. The next point I was going to make is completely gone from my head, but I think you found the term that you're talking about, iTunes.
Yeah, it was the precautionary principle. And if you look that up, it's somewhere, I actually heard that first of neo-Marxism, this precautionary principle, because it will come for everything. As I said, if it could save one life, it would come for your guns. It will come for your car. It will lock the whole country down because of something. Hachu! Yeah, it will come for everything.
Yes, I do remember what I was next going to say, which is that I think a better comparison for what we're discussing at the moment is the idea that we can't take this action because of the potential innocent party that might go through it. He mentions in the article as well that means that we can't actually arrest anyone because we might arrest an innocent person and sentence them to no action can be taken with 100% certainty. So he sort of makes that argument, which I think is a bit more, in my eyes, a bit more appealing.
May we just go through the slide presentation and go through the easiest arguments to debunk? Use that term.
Fake news on the death penalty.
Exactly.
Okay,
first of all, it drives me mad. It's in the 10 Commandments, it's 2013 Exodus. It's shall not murder, it's not shall not kill. It makes a huge difference behind it. And even the shall not kill is a false translation from, I think originally it was falsely translated from Hebrew into Latin, and from Latin it was also falsely translated into English or something like that. So you got a whole chain of translation. So the correct word is murder. If you go to the next slide, please. From the Hebrew, you might not see it, but the different version, mostly the King James Bible, I think is also the most widely circulated.
Yeah, I was very sad to see that King James Bible got it wrong.
Yeah, it's not thou shalt not kill, it's thou shalt not murder, because if you go to the next, it's from the Hebrew, it shall murder not, so to speak, and the word is Russia, something to that effect. I don't speak Hebrew and I'm not really versed in it, but as for my research I found this out. So the word is not to murder and not to kill, because it has different implications.
Well, it fundamentally changes the moral system that you're trying to put forward.
Exactly.
I don't quite understand how the King James Bible got this wrong, because it's not just a little mistake.
It's a giant mistake, yes.
And even if you're not religious, this is what we've built up on for the past 400 years. If you're in England, it's really interesting to track it back this far and see this really could have affected the structure of our society with this one change.
Yeah, actually, I think one of the big ones who got it wrong as well was Luther. The reformer himself got it wrong, because I got a Luther Bible, and it's I think it's not listed here. It's just a few ones, but mostly Americans, I think. And in the Luther Bible, it's wrong as well. In German, it would be kill would be töten, and murder would be morden, and it's töte. So du sollst nicht töten. So it's wrongfully translated as well.
Yeah, it's really this really took me by surprise that it was. I knew that there was that issue there, but I didn't realize just how far it went. I thought it was just as showed on this slide here, the American standard. I thought it was a more modern issue that came about. Before we carry on, there's just a couple of comments I just wanted to address. L.F. Graves has said that they've got a right-wing postmodern perspective on the death penalty, in which they see that, well, I'm reading into this, I think they mean that they see the death penalty as being justifiable because the population seeing criminals not have such severe punishment is a demoralizing factor on the populace.
Oh yeah, that's
how do you feel about that?
That's definitely a big part of how of the evolution of it in the Enlightenment perspective, particularly. So in the post-Enlightenment perspective, because the funny thing is that a lot of time, and I think Frederick the Great was particularly guilty of this, they wanted the visual effect of somebody being, for example, tortured to death in public, but they didn't want to actually inflict that pain. And so sometimes they would actually kill the person that was due to be executed and then torture them in public afterwards.
Yeah, I was in a conversation with someone, with a family member about this, and not so long back, and talking about how it was a certain public good to have it be a public affair. It keeps everyone in check to a degree, and it does have this certain moralizing factor to it.
I mean, in a sort of raw, maintaining the king's peace kind of sense, it also establishes the power, I suppose, and primacy of the state, and allows people to not think, or I guess promotes the idea of people not thinking themselves above the state or beyond the state at any particular point, because they, have capabilities beyond what the state is allowed to do. That's always going to be a very difficult situation when you've got people or groups inside the state who believe that they have equal power or even more power than the state in any given situation. And that's when you get some of the encounters between certain individuals and police officers, where the people can act as though they are above the police because they feel as though they are. It's hard to make that judgment when the state can just decide that you're going to be tortured to death in public, and that be something that everybody understands.
Yeah, but regarding to those points, I think it be a bit different to the continent and England, but on the continent it was a huge, or to be better, the privilege to execute somebody. In Germany it would be Blutrache or Blutstrafe, something to that effect, means that you are allowed to kill somebody, and you always had a big fight between the legal system, the councils, and the king or the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire to who has the right over the death penalty.
I should add as well that in the early Americas, I believe this was a big part of the assertion the assertions against the right of the British Empire and the rights of the central government at various later points, and that's kind of almost the essence of lynching in both its earlier and its later connotations. Because obviously in the start it was a measure used against loyalists quite often in the American sort of Revolutionary War period, where they would tar and feather, lynch loyalists and humiliate them in public and ensure that everybody sees that the central state has no power there.
Yes, I mean, if we're sticking along this sort of, as he's phrased it, postmodern line, the populace have a perspective on who is justified in taking life, and if that is monopolized by the state or by the monarch and his actors, then the power is absolute. Whereas in the cases as you described it with lynching, it's not just the individual death; it's the loosening of the grip of power over death. You're chipping away at that power, which in turn destabilizes not just the death penalty and who can inflict it, but it reduces the power levels in total for that state.
But
in the minds of the people, anyway, I would say.
Interesting point on this. Most, as far as I know, most populace were for the death penalty. The death penalty was mostly sneakily abolished. For example, I think in Great Britain, the majority of the people were for the death penalty, but it got abolished despite that. And in Switzerland, the big cantone decided for the smaller cantone that they won't longer will have the death penalty. So in certain regions, the death penalty as an instrument of the state, if you want to call that, was quite popular.
That's not a phenomenon specific to the death penalty, though, I should say as well. I mean, immigration is the other big one that comes to mind that's always been pushed in spite of the wishes of the public.
And as we're talking about Peter Hitchens, drug legalization. The war we never fought covers that quite extensively.
Many social issues have been pushed top down, and that this is probably one of them.
Yeah, I think at one part he just snipes against smoking the forbidden herb.
Yes, I did notice that. He just tried to sneak it in.
Yeah, just get the hook in.
It's like, obviously we've become a more degenerate populace, and there's more violence because of the constant smoking of marijuana.
Yeah,
I did quite like that.
Yeah, actually, quite wrote because if you go down on the Q&A on the death penalty, there's also a lot of other writings from him, and he also makes a case against marijuana. So yeah, it was quite interesting as well. And I didn't know that, because most common knowledge, if you want to call that, about marijuana use is that it's harmless.
Yeah, in The War We Never Fought, there's a whole chapter in which he pulls out just sections of articles of violent crime in which the person has been smoking marijuana. And he even says, I'm not doing this to say that it's going to make you violent, but the common conception that it makes you peaceful it's just not true. It lowers your inhibitions, just like many other drugs do, and that can make you capable of things that you wouldn't be capable in a fully conscious state. So yeah, The War We Never Fought is one of his most one of his most reactionary works, I think, because it's something that is a conversation that's had by literally no one other than Peter Hitchens. So I recommend everyone read that. What have we got on this slide here? Execution figures.
Yeah, those figures are about the death penalty in the United States. It's from 1937 to, it's the newest one I found. And the point about this is to make that about the point before we talked about the precautionary principle, it's that maybe 1.5%, to round it up bigly, is probably innocently executed by their wording from the death penalty information center. So that's not a lot, to be honest. And a lot of people got how you call it in English, if you get free after your verdict was overturned?
Paroled? No, acquitted?
Acquitted, yeah.
Yeah, acquitted. I mean, if you get acquitted, you might be not on death row, but you did not get executed. It might be a broken shell, but you didn't hang or got shot or sat on the electric stool. So yeah, just to get those numbers into a visual, because it's not that a lot. It's talking about 1%. So yeah, just so you have a orientation. Anybody else a point about this?
Yeah, well, as we've said before, playing around with statistics, you can come to all sorts of conclusions, but it is good to have these sorts of figures to hand to say, it's 1%. And if you're potentially saving the lives, if you are looking at it this consequentialist attitude, if you can save the lives of 3% of the murder victims and only 1% of people are going to be innocently executed, then the utilitarian outcome might be that it's better to have the death penalty legalized.
Right, exactly what I was going to say is, get the you might say that the deterrent effect is poor. You could even come to that conclusion, but if it is effective to the extent that 2% of the victims of homicide or potential victims of homicide are saved instead, then you've still got a net positive effect, I suppose. You've saved more lives than you've condemned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So next up, am I going to need to click through on this, or can you explain
no,
it?
This is just a link. So you see every execution from 1860 until abolishment in Canada. It's really interesting because you also see in the 1950s, you see you see the numbers of the people going to get executed is highly reduced. I mean, you might click on it, but don't dox yourself.
Yeah, that's why I was hesitant to click through on it. I'll put all of the links that you provided in the notes afterwards.
Okay, yeah, it's just it's really interesting, and you see also the people that execute. I might add, they mostly deserve it. A lot of them killed, I think, killed or murdered, to be concrete, and murdered police officers, their wives, or some just people in the streets, and or I think some or children, child murderers are on the list as well. So yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted. Sorry to interrupt. I just want to say that with the figures of murder that he did bring up, one of the most shocking things to me was the level of infanticide. Like the high proportion of murder is infanticide. But yeah, sorry, carry on.
Yeah, that's mostly about that. So you see, it's Canada. It's only in Canada, because if you go to the next slide. Canada is the favorite favorite beating horse to go around and show, oh, the death penalty didn't bring anything, because if you say, oh, the death penalty was abolitioned 1967, it doesn't look like much, but the last execution was 1926. So 62. I get the numbers mixed up always because German and English. So anyway. Yeah, you see, after the last execution, the numbers of homicide skyrockets almost and never falls down to the levels since there were the last executions. It might all be the points as well we talked about before, about you can't really compare the numbers because of the will to kill is there, but if you try to kill somebody, you only wound them, and you don't kill them, you only send them to the hospital and leave a big scar, but you won't kill them actually.
Right, that's one thing that jumps out to me about this, is that you would expect that, all other things being equal, the number of homicides would drop because medical technology is improving and infrastructure is improving and all that kind of thing, to make sure that more people are going to survive their near homicide, I suppose, or attempted homicide. Whereas if they're staying stable, that implies that there's an increased number of attempted homicides that are taking place, which is somewhat obfuscated by the improvements in technology that are able to keep people alive.
Yes, and I didn't search for the wounding numbers in Canada and all this, but I probably will do it to a later point. But I got a life as well and finance this year, so I got a lot of other things to do.
On the, again, to play devil's advocate though, these are the pure figures, aren't they? So population growth would be a factor.
If you would go to the next slide, please.
I almost set you up for that.
I thought it was adjusted per capita actually. So yeah.
This is
that wasn't even intentional, but yes, I forgot about this next slide.
Yeah, it's I know my stuff somewhat. Yeah, but as you see, as Canada has a giant increase in populations, you see the homicide rate goes down slightly, but still it's highly levitated. I mean, it's not down like in the 1960s, but still.
Yeah, so I again, just constant theme throughout some of the answers that he provides in the essay. Statistics can be fudged, and to me, a very important lesson to learn from this that we see quite often: a law on the books is meaningless if not enforced. And so these statistics that can be used, if you look at them purely from when it was de jure abolished, then obviously it tells one story. But if they're not being used for, 14 years prior, then you're not getting the full story.
Yeah, and also a little trick is I wanted to chart it way back further, so I could chart the number of all the people executioned as well and the homicide rate. So maybe you get a ratio, and after you stop the execution, obviously the ratio would flip up, but I could not do it and did not have the time. So maybe in a further point I will do this. And still, if you don't distrust me, those you can go to the link which I have provided. They are charted in a long line every year. You can chart this yourself out.
Yes. Okay. So I think this is the last slide. This one here. What are we looking at here?
I might have to unmute myself, but this is maybe we have to back up here a little bit, because
talk us through this one.
Yeah, this is the death penalties or executions in the Middle Ages, and especially during the Reformation. But for this, I have to back up a lot of time, because the problem was with the death penalty that the church got heavily involved with the executions. For example, you couldn't crucify people anymore because it was an unknoble or whatever thing to do.
What a load of killjoys.
Sorry, what?
What a load of killjoys. Sorry, go on.
Okay, I don't get this one. But yeah, the church got heavily involved into the death penalty, and took some few years, but the church was, at one point, it was only the state that did the execution, but the Catholics, the bleeding hearts or sacrificing heart, or however they're called, got more and more involved and made possible that your soul got saved. For example, if you didn't got baptized before you went, you got executed. They offered you. It might be a weird thing, because if you confess, you will get executed, but your soul will get saved. But if you don't confess, you will go to hell, but will probably get by. But other story. But the point is that the time the Reformation came along, that the church was heavily involved with the death penalty, so much so that the Pope could make decrees what was allowed to be executed. This is, for example, why the reason you could get executed for blasphemy, because the Pope wrote somewhat, has written, give me a second, has written, if you want to call it that, a paper that people could get executed for blasphemy as well. And
You mean a decree, or?
yeah, decree, yes. I think somewhere I have the name.
It's not too important.
Yeah, whatever. But this is the point. I think you made it earlier because of the history. The history of the death penalty is never really talked about, because it's really interesting. For example, there wasn't all before this. There were the, as I said before, there was the Blutgerichtsbarkeit. It's blood jurisdictions, something like that. That the Kaiser could postpone on the different shires or cantone or smaller circles of jurisdictions, and those would fight over the death penalty somewhat. For example, the consuls or parliaments in every city wanted people to get execute, to get rid of people that annoyed them, that did crime and whatever, but the jurisdiction was made out of people from the noble crowd, and those people didn't want to execute because they wanted to be a noble Christian prince for this example, and so they tried to shun away from the death penalty, but they would still speak the death penalty at some points. So this is, yeah, might have to get my notes in order quickly.
I think it was spoken about last time. Maybe it was on the myth of absolutism that we spoke about the high levels of people being let off when the king was around as a show of his grace. So yeah, there's certain conceptions that we have historically about the death penalty which are really off the mark. I mean, some of them aren't. There were periods of time where levels were, I would say, higher than I would expect for crimes that I would probably not recommend that people were put to the sword. But in general, this view that the term the Middle Ages, that it was just this oppressive period where people were getting their hands cut off for stealing a grain of rice. It's really overblown in the modern conception.
Yeah, so as far as I know, and it would theoretically be borne out by this graph that we're looking at right now, there was a trend in the sort of barbarian, or the Germanic kingdoms period, through into the Middle Ages, where execution would be more associated with either sort of personal feuds that had to be mediated, less so there over time, very much towards the start of this period that I'm talking about, and then trailing off. But then more towards property crimes. So theft and things like that would be punished much more harshly than we would associate now. Big part of that would be just because it's kind of more associated with, so a man's estate is quite closely tied to his honor, and so if he's perceived to be unable to defend his estate and his property, then he's perceived to be somebody who can be trampled all over, and he has no honor and won't defend himself properly.
Yeah. And I think that's an important point, is that infringing on someone's property rights back then, it wasn't because it wasn't this modern conception of property rights where it was because it's my stuff. It was very much that is an infringement on his person. It's putting yourself above him and infringing on his honor. So that's why it was so severe punishments for theft.
Yeah, this will also be reflected in the graph, but I have to make a little closing of the bow. For example, there were also a lot of different jurisdictions. For example, you got Kaiser law, you got university law, you got law that was just conducted because your ancestor conducted it like that. It's not the modern conception of the law, of the three branches of government. That's a modern invention.
Yes, that's very much a product of the 19th century. But I was just going to say quickly, to top off my point, is that when you get into the sort of Reformation period, you get a more trending towards crimes, like moral crimes and execution for moral crimes and blasphemies and things like that, as iTunes touched on earlier. Yeah, and so that's a big part of where this spike comes from. And also, oddly, you get much more of a willingness to execute women, which was a little bit more absent prior.
Do you think the 1600s tainted the view of the entire Middle Ages?
Probably.
I think it probably did. The whole Reformation period seems to have tainted our perception.
Yeah, and it was quite funny because it was during the Reformation, presumably those enlightened figures. But we can go over the figures in a few minutes. As you said, some crimes were just more or less brutal, or more, how you call them, different regions in the Holy Roman Empire in English. Just regions, or
I don't know, principalities maybe.
Principalities.
Yeah, principalities.
Yeah, some principalities were judged differently. For example, in my paper, I used the example Poland wasn't big fan of doing stuff with a wife you're not married to. For example, if you would do that, your balls would nailed to the where you go shopping. How you call it in English?
To a Tesco's.
Market.
Yeah, market. Your balls would get nailed on the floor on the market. So that's not the same as for example in Zurich or some other parts in Germany where the law was somewhat more relaxed, if you want to call it that.
Well, was that Polish punishment that you just mentioned, was that in the Reformation period by chance?
Oh no, that was not more. It was in the 11th hundred.
Oh, that's quite interesting, actually.
How so?
Just because it doesn't seem to have been the norm, as far as I know.
But for this is my point. In some principalities, there were a lot harsher punishments than in others.
Yeah.
Yeah. Happy Easter, everyone. After that.
Yeah.
Nailing stuff to something else is an Easter tradition. So.
I'm on a tradition,
Yeah. And as you said, what got really heavily punished was theft or crimes against property and crimes against the religious order. That was pretty the most crimes. But otherwise, if you didn't do stuff and you didn't try to abort a baby, you probably didn't get executed.
And even so, you might have been commuted anyway if the prince happens to be passing through.
Yes, that's the point. I also have somewhere. If if the king came through your city, he came in a carriage, and all the people that got thrown out of the town could go behind the carriage, and the prince or Kaiser or whatever could allow them to get back into the city. But they were shunned from the council. But the prince overrules the council. So sometimes, probably as Rupert will know, they executed all those people or brought them further away from the city.
Yeah, tried to get them out of the way so that that the king couldn't come along and bestow his mercy on all of the ne'er-do-wells, and then leave it on the local townsfolk to try and deal with the fallout of that.
Just on some of the misconceptions in my head, I was thinking of Franz Schmidt, and I just looked up the figures of his executions. So he was he Bavarian? Where is it?
He was Nuremberg.
Oh, Nuremberg. Yeah, so he had a 45-year long career, and he carried out 361 executions, which is eight executions a year. So, these are not particularly large figures. And he's the figure that everyone puts forward as being, this harbinger of death.
Oh yeah, some principality were more soft than others, but I guess we can go now into the figures exactly, if you want to. Does anybody has a question regarding the graph or something else before we start, or maybe some points they have open before I can start my ramblings?
Well, just one quick thing is that to Hitchens' point about the soft abolition of the death penalty, would we have to go all the way back to the mid 16th century to find out what exactly the deterrent effect was? Because after that point, it seems to be a general downward trend overall on who's actually being executed. How many executions are actually taking place.
Oh, this is a nice point. Just sliding right in there, as I would have paid you for that point. No, it's actually not. The Protestants start executing a lot of more. Started executing different behavior. For example, I have it somewhere here. In Nuremberg, 1501 or till 1570, 6% of the executed were women. After this period, from 1571 to 1660, 50% of the women were executed.
that was all preamble before Graves.
Yeah, and
the real rambling begins now.
Yeah, but boy, are we only just starting the rambling? Yes, sir. And I hope it's as confusing as fuck because I'm German. Vielleicht sollte ich den ganzen Teil in German machen.
Whilst you're just looking through, I want to do a quick show of hands in the chat. Actually, it'd be interesting. If you are in favour of the death penalty, press 1. If you're against it, press 2. I'm just interested to see the figures. You go ahead, iTunes. We'll see if we get some responses.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and after the Reformation, as I said, 15% of the women were executed. In Zurich, there was something similar, because in the 1500s, more or less 5% executed were women. In the 1600s, it was 12%. In the 1700s, it was 28%. And in the 1800s, it was 36%. So you can see more or less in Zurich, especially differentiation between before the Reformation and after the Reformation, as Zurich was a prominent place of the Reformation with Zwingli. So the greater point behind this is that you can see the moral shift, or the moral worldview shift from what you do or against what is your crime. For example, most of those people, because you see a shift from getting people executed for crimes against your property to crimes against or crimes condemned done by women, as abortions, not sleeping with your husband, or not, that's the wrong word, sleeping with a man that isn't your husband, points like this. Yes, and as well, most of those around those before the Reformation, about 60% overall were people that were executed for property crimes. After this, the number was quite lower. It was about 40% that were executed for property crimes. So yeah, I might drink some sip of water.
Yeah, go ahead. Unanimous decision in the chat, regardless of the figures. Let's ignore that. Doesn't matter how many entrants there are. Any freelance? What's your thoughts? You've remained suspiciously quiet so far.
Oh, I've been listening to the ramblings. It seems there is a shift from having punishment for things like property theft and arson, especially arson, which would have been much more serious than it is nowadays because firefighting techniques were not as good. We had a lot more wooden buildings, so property destruction was a very big one, and it seems to have shifted to something which was more moral, like abortion and adultery. So, and then on the other hand, what I was thinking about was that about baptizing before somebody was executed, that you could still get into like the paradise in the afterlife, while perhaps after the Reformation, people started thinking more about creating paradise on earth. So somebody should be able to repent and reform while he was still alive. And that's something we see nowadays in the judicial system as well, that people are supposedly able, even after any kind of crime, able to return to society. So that was my thought about it.
The justification for it, and I suppose everything that's taking place around execution in the wider society is something that we haven't really talked about so much because it doesn't really come up in the debate too much, but it's actually quite important, and that kind of goes to this this angle of getting baptized and hopefully being allowed into heaven despite being a criminal. Is that one other thing that I've read about in passing, but haven't really been able to find much more about, was the idea that the atmosphere of a public execution in the sort of Middle Ages kind of period, medieval period, was much more of everyone in the crowd being sort of almost rooting for the criminal to be, sort of granted some kind of like clemency by the process of the execution, thus stopping them from doing further evil, but also perhaps some element of like the pain being an aid for them to be getting into heaven or something like that. So it's almost as though they were cheering on the person to be able to actually get into heaven. And there are some weird accounts about that. It comes up in one of Dan Carlin's hardcore histories. He did one specifically on this topic, a podcast specifically on the topic of like public executions.
Oh yeah, there's an interesting point. If the rope gets destroyed by hanging a person, the person gets set free. This is actually the presumption of innocence we have today.
It's a presumption of divine intervention.
Yeah, exactly. If the rope breaks, it's a sign of divine intervention, and therefore you're spoken free. So this is also a point that we may have to consider, and I have forgotten until thanks for reminding me. But a point about this is that you could set free by, so to speak, a higher force, say be it the destruction of the rope, or sometimes if the executioner hits his kill swing, you get set free. And this is where the presumption of innocence comes from.
Well, could I also finish this point quickly, because it goes somewhere else additionally. The point that I was making, in that I think it feeds into or comes from an earlier sort of Germanic kingdoms conception, where they perceived the act of execution to be almost like a mechanical sort of thing that is simply in response to being presented with somebody who is clearly like a criminal in almost like that is their destiny. They're just fated to be a criminal, and that is all that they will do. Therefore, it's merely a procedural response to be executing them. That's just you doing your duty. And I think that's it's almost in opposition. It's a much more essentialist way of viewing things than we do generally in the modern day, whereby we perceive the acts that have led somebody to be put in front of a jury and potentially being given the death sentence, that we see that as being a product of their environment almost entirely, and they are completely redeemable if they can be properly rehabilitated. Whereas large portions of the Germanic kingdoms sort of era world viewed it in almost the opposite sense, whereby the response of executing a criminal is almost just like something that's reflexive and a duty that you have to perform in response to being presented with this evil person.
Yeah, I think Kant has a line on this as well. Wenn gemordet hat, muss sterben. I think something akin to that in English, meaning if you murdered somebody, I think you have to execute him. Something to that reflective mechanism.
Yeah, right. So it's like there isn't the perception that the state is, I suppose, choosing to kill somebody or choosing to murder somebody as it would be sort of framed in the modern sense, but more that it's just another job that the state has to do in response to this thing that's happened.
Yeah, the word that Hitchens used in the article is dispassionate, which I think falls into that essentialist view that you're describing. It's this sort of preventative measure to stop any kind of more vengeful repercussions, as he describes it, which I think is accurate. And when was the article written? I can't remember, but was it 2008?
I think so, yes.
Yeah. And he finished it. Let me bring it up. The way he finishes it off is apropos. Hang on. Yeah, so just at the very end, he says, if, as I fear, respect for the criminal justice system continues to dwindle, especially among the abandoned honest poor, which he might be slightly off with that group, but we can expect to see an increase of vigilante private justice, even lynch mobs. Like I say, this was in 2008, and what have we seen this last year but vigilante private justice groups and lynch mobs?
Well, there's even more of that than we would be conventionally led to believe, because one thing that the police has not, this is in a UK context very specifically, one thing that the police has not been too keen to let slip to the public is the extent to which they've been trying to deal with sort of anti-pedophile vigilante groups that have popped up, particularly since the grooming gang stuff came along.
Yeah.
There's a lot of that sort of simmering in the background that is very seldom acknowledged in the public sphere, and I think it is probably part of this whole. Well, there's a much bigger issue at play there with distrust of the police, but the toothlessness, the perceived toothlessness of the state is probably a big part of what's feeding into that.
Exactly. People feel like justice is not being served, and so they will serve it themselves, and it doesn't help anyone when they're taking it into their own hands. I'm sorry, carry on.
Isn't this a point of if the state is weak, somebody has to fill that vacuum?
Mm-hmm. No, I completely understand why they're doing it. I sympathize with it, but what I'm saying is that they shouldn't have to, and that it's less. it's a cause of a very weak system and a system that's very ineffective. And I can understand why they're doing it. And it's not them that's the issue. It's the system that they're in.
So the question is, are we a modern kind of Weimar Germany?
Is that even a question now? I mean, have we not seen enough examples of that?
Oh no, it's a serious question because I read a little bit on the French Revolution as well, and the time before that was quite turbulent as well. But the French Revolution wasn't anything better. So I think a strong man, quote unquote, had to step in. And if you look to Weimar Germany, you got a similar situation. But a strong man was a certain Austrian painter.
The real question is, how many people were executed in Weimar?
That would be an interesting question. I don't know, to be honest.
Well, the nuance there, and that gets partially into my position on the whole thing, is that the state de facto was authorizing a lot of executions that the state didn't necessarily carry out themselves. And so, for example, when the state was willing to turn a blind eye to the ways in which the communist uprisings were being subdued, that is the state signing off on death that they're not willing to own, as it were. So in a roundabout way, the state executed Rosa Luxemburg, for example, but that's not something that they conducted officially. Likewise, I think in the modern day, there's quite a lot of instances where the state is almost willing to sign off on a certain amount of death that's happening at the hands of police and such. I suppose this is very contemporarily relevant as well. But
yeah, I think
let's not bring up any barbiturate addicts.
Yeah. But it's not taking place within a structured environment, and we're not going through the due diligence to find out whether or not we could have done this any other way, or all of that kind of thing. So we're almost coming at it from the opposite perspective of the legalistic side, where we're looking at that sort of 1.3% or whatever it is of people who might be wrongly executed, and by hyper focusing on this one little point, we are kind of not acknowledging, but just allowing this greater scheme of death to take place at the hands of the state, because we are enabling people to think that they are in a stronger position, or enabling people to challenge the state.
I want to touch on this. I want to touch on this because it's not just this that we see it happening. We see it happening with almost everything, where it's the neoliberal way to not marry state and private business, but to have a connection in which both can pass responsibility to the other. And so what you have at the moment when it comes to something to justice dispensal is you have an ineffective police force, but they are standing aside to let a violent mob carry out quote unquote justice. But then the mob can say that, they don't even care to answer any questions, so they'll carry out whatever they want to and loot and burn everything down as much as they want. And the police will say, well, we didn't carry out that action. We were just unable to stop it because of X, Y, and Z.
Or you have the same relationship. So more what I'm getting at is the same relationship taking place between the central state or the justice system and the police force. So the police force are constantly put into these situations where they have to de facto carry out the death penalty. And
I
think that's more American.
May I interject here?
Yeah, carry on.
Because I think I can neatly round this up in a bow, because it's an equation, and then I guess on one side it's raw force, and the question is how you handle that force. The force being, for example, violent criminal that murder people savagely and barbarically. But the question is, how do you funnel that into the legal system, where the parliament, for that example, has to stand up and affirm, yes, we want the death penalty, otherwise this force will get transferred something else, be it if they don't want death penalty, it will get transferred to the police, but the force is still there. So it may be a stupid phrase, but the earth demands its blood. So there's a certain amount of people that die, but the question of the circumstance, or the question is how. It's not can we prevent them, but they will die. The question is how, and maybe we could prevent it a little bit. For example, I think there's 20 people that get saved by, or hypothetically get saved by not using the death penalty for being executed innocently. But how many people get shot by the police in America every year? And did they have a trial? And I guess this force has to be, force has to be channeled somewhat. And if isn't channeled correctly, it's just narco-tyranny, something like that.
Yeah, well, there's a natural order to things, and justice falls into that sphere. And the system of natural justice has been broken, but just because the formalized system or the traditional system has been broken, it doesn't mean it's not going to happen. It just means it's revealing itself in different ways now. And again, it's obfuscation. Everything that's done is obfuscation. It's that they realize that harsh punishment is required, but it doesn't sound very liberal to say it, so they allow it to reveal itself in different ways. Yeah,
the force is carried onto the streets, or the barbarians are onto the gates. A certain black how you call it? No, it's not black bloc. Sorry, it's black bloc. Tactics are used, and businesses are destroyed, and the businesses have to intervene to defend the.
I was hovering over the mute button for a long time there. Just.
I don't want. Yes, I don't go down this. Yeah, black bloc.
Yeah, that term was thrown around quite a lot a few years back, but I've not really heard it for a while. A very good point is very good point has been made in the chat. Blair removed the death penalty because he knew he'd fall victim to it after he was done. Well, has he faced any repercussions so far? Is my question. I'm not sure that. Well, we're definitely touching. Let's change subject pretty quickly.
Okay, how's the weather?
Yeah, how's Easter going?
Well, have we got anything else to cover of the more formal structure of this presentation?
Let's veer off very quickly. I haven't got anything else to cover without getting us taken off air.
I think we should round it up a little bit, but it's just coitus interrupted, I would guess, for some people watching or listening.
Yeah, I think we covered a lot in the hour and 20 minutes that we were doing that. I was very happy. So I don't think I've got anything else to say. Freelance?
I'm just wondering if the rate of death penalties performed correlates with the means a society have to imprison people. So just wondering, is there some economic reason why this happens?
Oh yeah, I think the Calvinists invented the prisons somewhat to get people off getting executed. Otherwise, they would banish. I mean, today you can't really banish people. But
you certainly could. It's just a lack of imagination that we don't.
Yeet them into space.
Well, it's a rather cheap way of dealing with criminals, just killing them, because you don't need to guard them anymore. Forced labor is not that effective. So and people have a day out. You can go to the public execution. So I could imagine that in hard times it would be preferable to execute some people.
Actually, that's a good point. I do have something else to say on that. An argument against the death penalty I've heard made is that keeping someone alive is cheaper than the death penalty because there's so many restrictions on it. It costs X amount of thousands of dollars to kill them, as opposed to how much it takes to run a prison.
That's all bureaucracy. So
yeah,
just add it on.
It's such a poor argument that I don't know why anyone makes it.
It's true, yeah, but you know why?
Yeah, exactly. It's like
no. Do you know why?
Because of the red tape involved in execution. You can't really. Maybe branding would be nice to have on this, but you can't really execute people swiftly in America. You have to go to this hurdle and this hurdle and this hurdle and this hurdle, and obviously, if you lay your bureaucracy on top of bureaucracy, it will cost more. I mean, have you ever met a bureaucrat that isn't fond of burning money? Yeah.
I just say dig a hole, put people in it up to the waist to their neck, and just throw some rocks at it. I mean,
how expensive is a piece of rope?
Embrace tradition.
It sounds very biblical to me.
Oh yeah, that's quite funny because the Arabs do that a lot still today, but that was one of the execution that was prohibited in Europe. So yeah.
See, we've been liberalizing for God knows how long. Right, let's wrap up pretty swiftly with the levels of spice that have come about all of a sudden. Yeah, I've not got anything else to say, Rupert.
No, I think pretty much the conversation that we were having earlier on the preservation of force or state force or state power is basically the main point that I wanted to hit. Other than that, and of course the background context in which these conversations take place, like what is the rest of society thinking? What is the perception of a person's ability to be rehabilitated, I suppose, or whether they are, whether some quality of them is almost integrally criminal that just needs to be removed, or perhaps terminally antisocial, something like that. So yeah, I think those are the important points that kind of lead me in the direction that I think about this issue. So yeah, I think I'm good.
iTunes.
I mean, I could go on a rant about crucifixion and Jesus, but I think I will let it be.
We haven't scheduled it in, but it might be interesting as I think we've had a decent chat out of this. It might be interesting to take a look at some arguments against it and see if we think any of them hold water, or if they're none of them are any good.
Should I do it now, or should we leave it?
No, not now. We'll end it now. But it might be interesting to take a look at some arguments on the other side of the fence, because I think there are valid arguments, and I think that a lot of them are addressed in the article. But I'm sure that we can find some that hold water.
I mean, I guess if you would go to the contra side of the death penalty, to Amnesty International and its sub NGOs, I guess you're not digging that deep. Let's just say.
I mean, we could get very utilitarian, because obviously places like ancient Greece had different solutions to the problem of antisocial people, in that they did just send them off to go and form new colonies instead.
Fun fact about the death penalty, and Mill was the founder of utilitarian, something like that.
Well, Bentham and then Mill, really autistically made the calculus.
Yeah, because Mill were for the death penalty quite rigorously.
Well, it makes sense, yeah.
Yeah,
they're completely consequentialist. So
if it's just a numbers game, chop.
If you can kill 1 million people and save 1,000,001 lives, then yep, go ahead. Okay. All right. On that note, let's wrap up. What are we looking at next time? In a couple of weeks' time, we're going to be. I think it's going to be an interview.
Ayn Rand, I think.
Ayn Rand, yes. We're going to be taking a look at an interview with Ayn Rand. I think it's by the same fellow who interviewed Huxley, Mike Wallace, I think was his name. So that should be interesting. But we will leave everyone to have a happy rest of their Easter with these pleasant thoughts in your head. And we shall see you next time.
Bye.
Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.